So welcome everybody. My name is Bill Cope. I work at the University of Illinois. I'm actually coming from Champaign, Illinois. You might be able to pick that I don't have a Central Illinois accent. I'm actually originally from Australia, which is a kind of nice coincidence because our plenary speaker is in Australia as well. She's in Canberra, in Australia. So welcome everybody. Very pleased to have you here. What I thought I would do, or the way we might structure this session, and tell me, Deborah and Tamsin, if we should do anything different from this, is I might get Deborah to do a kind of a very quick synopsis of the talk. I'm hoping you've all watched the video. It's a very nicely presented video, but if you haven't, I thought we might get Deborah just to sort of summarize the main themes in the paper, and then you can watch the recording afterwards, which is often just as good a way to go. So we might do that, and then what I'd like people to do is ask questions with voice. You know, put your hand up and we'll speak, or put questions in the chat for discussion. But also, I'd like everybody to introduce themselves when they do that. You know, so if you come on with voice and whatever, you don't necessarily have to have the video on, but it'd be great if you would kind of introduce yourselves as well, because we can get to know a little bit about each other as well. So why don't we start then, Deborah, with you kind of kicking off with a quick intro about the main themes in your paper.
Sure, Bill, thanks. So as Bill mentioned, well, I'm actually physically in Canberra right now, but I work at the University of New South Wales in Sydney, and I usually commute between the two cities, but in this day and age, I get to stay in Canberra to work at the moment. So, I'm interested in Australians' experiences of the COVID crisis, and I understand, and of course it's inevitable, given the very distinct political way that different nations have dealt with the crisis in their own countries. It's quite fascinating to also, I think, explore the experiences of the people living in those countries as they've gone through various stages of the crisis in their own countries. And again, still there's differences in the peaks and the ebbs and the flows of the pandemic in their own countries and different timings of that, which is why I did include in the presentation a slide that just gives a timeline of COVID in Australia, because we'll have some different kind of events happening in our country from what is happening in your countries. And of course, we comparatively, we have thus far managed to contain the spread of the coronavirus quite well. We have had a recent surge, but nothing compared to a lot of countries, and particularly the US, of course, where things do seem to be quite disastrous. So I would, it would be really interesting to connect with other researchers too who are working on people's experiences in their own countries and compare, because I think when you apply a sort of socio-political lens to how people are dealing with, how governments are dealing with the COVID crisis, but also how the everyday person, the everyday lay person and citizen is dealing with working through all the different impingements on their life as well as on their health. It would be really interesting just to make those comparisons. So my presentation is about Australia. I conducted a telephone interview, in-depth study, talking to a range of Australians in basically across our very large continent. And so that's where doing the kind of, distant interview process is great, because you can actually talk by telephone. It's an old technology really, talk by telephone to people, and they can be in any location. And I was actually quite keen. Australia is quite an urban population. Many of us are clustered around the fringes, particularly the east coast of Australia. But what that means is that people living in rural and remote regions often don't get included in social research, but doing telephone interviews meant that they could be included. So I do have quite a few people involved from rural regions. And what is coming out, so I basically used the interview materials to generate detailed case studies for each of the 40 participants involved. And as I explain in the presentation, I take a socio-material approach, and I'm interested in not just what people say about their practices and experiences, but what they say about what they do. I'm interested in the material objects in their lives, and of course objects such as soap and hand sanitizer and face masks have become incredibly important in the way that we practice our everyday lives in response to the COVID crisis, just as you know, a few examples. So I've also been documenting myself, newspaper articles, coverage, you know, public health campaigns, you know, my own spatial environment and the signs. Signage has been really important when we enter public spaces in terms of where we're told to move, what we're told to do with our bodies. So I've been trying to document those aspects as well as talking to people about their own experiences. So I do include a few of those photos I've taken myself, you know, the empty supermarket shelves, the COVID Safe app that we have been encouraged to use here in Australia, and then many other countries have similar contact tracing apps that they've developed. Some cases successfully, other cases not so successfully. And I've just got, yes, drawing on the case studies for each person, I've been able to sort of construct what I call a COVID life narrative, building on the stories that they tell really about how they've lived through a 2-month period of the COVID lockdown in our country. And I provide some examples from how they talk about their initial concepts of risk, which was very much about, oh, you know, COVID's happening somewhere else, particularly in China, because that's where we all heard it originated from in the news media. But then a dawning awareness that, well, actually it is a problem for Australia and for myself. And so I give some examples of that kind of moment, that kind of understanding, and what sparked that understanding that, yes, maybe we are at risk here in Australia from the COVID crisis. So I'll leave it there because I don't want to spend too much time, and I'm interested in any comments or questions.
Great, no, thank you for that. Well, a very, very, very nice summary of an interesting paper. So, folks, again, the protocol is if you'd like to speak, I think you can either put up your hand or you can just simply speak and introduce yourself first. And I think one very important, one interesting comparison would be, you know, how are you experiencing this compared to the way that Deborah has explained the Australian experience? What's similar and what's different about your experience? That might be a good way to start. So anybody want to kick off? If people are a little bit reticent, I've got a question actually, but I'll don't be shy, folks. It's always hard to be the first person. I know that.
I think Catherine has a question.
Oh, great, Catherine. Excellent. Sorry, I didn't see you.
Hi.
Yeah.
No, it's okay. I wasn't sure if I should like raise my hand or anything.
Yeah. This is the Zoom thing. We've all learned to do this.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, hi everyone. My name is Catherine. I'm a recent graduate with a public health degree in the US. And I'm at this conference because I got accepted last year to present on what would have been the Paris event today and tomorrow. So it's nice to be here with all of you. My question was for you, Deborah. So you talk in your presentation about these assemblages, the physical aspects, the social aspects of the virus that are sort of really resonating with people. And I was wondering if there were any themes or trends in how people responded. Like, I know you said people miss going out to dinner, or they're streaming a lot more, or something like that. But did you find that some assemblages were more significant than others in terms of how people are responding to them?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I guess the great thing about constructing case studies on each person, which gives a detailed account of their experiences, really emphasizes the actual variability of people's experiences, even within just 40 people living in Australia, in different parts of Australia. So they did come from all states and territories, and from big cities, and from small towns or even farms. So, you know, there's so much of richness to write about, because it really struck me when I was going through the case studies and thinking about how to analyze them, is that the sheer difference in people's experiences. So that, for example, there's some people who have been barely touched by the crisis. You know, they live on a farm, they don't see many people usually. They often have their partner living with them, so they have someone that they're used to spending time with. You know, they only go into town occasionally. For them, life had hardly changed. Then you compare it with, there was one woman who was dealing with her young children being at home from childcare and school, as well as trying to keep up her full-time job and work from home online. And as you can imagine, that was a very stressful experience, juggling those commitments. And her relationship actually broke up with her partner during that time. So she had a very, very different experience from the older person who might be retired, who doesn't have to juggle young children and work commitments, and whose only kind of main change was that they couldn't get to do their regular, you know, gym class anymore. So yes, I mean, I also noticed quite a difference between those living in the big cities and those living in rural regions, even within this one country of Australia. People in rural regions felt a lot safer. And again, there's probably, you know, there's a rational reason for that, because there weren't many people in their area who were infected with the virus. And they were aware of that. They kept an eye on the statistics, the figures. But again, there was also a difference between states, because we have closed some of our borders between states. And people liked that. They said, okay, there's a real territorialism was coming into play, which actually hasn't existed in Australia. Well, since the Spanish flu 100 years ago, that was the last time they changed the borders, people were saying, I'm glad our borders are closed and the people from, you know, this state next to me can't come into my state. So there was an interesting kind of otherness going on there. And another thing that I talked to people about that I didn't have a chance to talk about in the presentation was I did ask people, what do you think will happen post-COVID? What do you think your life will be like? Because I was interested in their imaginaries about the future. And most people were actually quite optimistic. And again, I think the context is important here. We're in Australia where we've managed to contain the virus quite successfully compared to a lot of other countries. And most people said things like, well, I've noticed that, you know, they were concerned that they'd noticed some racism against Chinese people. We have a large Chinese population in Australia, immigrant population. But they said, I think, you know, it was dealt with quite, you know, the media did cover it, and I'm hoping that Australians will be kind of aware of it in future. And they were quite optimistic about, you know, life actually not changing too much. Having said that, we've just entered into our first recession in 3 decades. So there were people who were untouched by unemployment, but there are other people who did worry about getting a job. So I guess it was just really, really variable, and it did really emphasize the very situated and changing and complex nature of all these different parts of the assemblage: geographical location, age, gender, whether you had care of young children, you know, all of those elements really did play an important role.
Great, thank you for that. Susan Epstein's the next person. So Susan, over to you.
Okay, sorry, I only have 1 bar of 5G. I'm out in the country, that's where I live, so hopefully this is clear. Can you hear me okay?
Very well, yes.
Good, thank you. So I also thought the assemblages were very interesting, and I was kind of thinking at the very end of the talk, when you had the same graphic as at the beginning, that there was going to be some kind of relation between the two. But then I realized there wasn't, but that's something that I understand the whole case study challenge, but it would have been so interesting to have some of the personal experiences somehow coded to the different general elements in the first graphic, the first assemblage group, because then I think also it could provide a way for people to compare internationally which themes maybe were resonating more. sorry. Dropped my iPad. Which themes were resonating more in which countries? I don't know. I thought it just could be very interesting. I loved the whole setup of the talk. It was so clear, and I was like, oh my gosh, this could go so many different directions. And also I didn't know anything about socio-material, is that what it's called? Research. So just even that whole concept was really interesting to me. So that's all. Those are my thoughts about that, and I'll let.
Yeah, thank you, Susan. So yeah, I do have two, in the presentation there are two slides that show assemblages.
Breakfast is TV snacks. You know those yeah, chocolate ones? Yeah. That's breakfast. Breakfast dessert.
I've just muted her. Someone had it on by mistake, their microphone on by mistake.
All right, sorry. So
I've just muted her. That's okay.
So yes, there's two assemblages slides. One is actually about COVID assemblages in general, and then the later one is specifically about risk assemblages. So what I try and do is sort of narrow in the risk assemblages part, I narrow down a little bit more specifically to based on what people were saying. So that the first assemblages was just generally about the conceptual approach, and then the risk assemblages was actually drawing on the themes from the interviews and what they actually said about their own assemblages of risk. But yes, you know, as you can tell already, I'm sure there was just so much. I mean, I've got so much rich data. I'm kind of got this long list of articles to write from this project, and I'm really going to be, I mean, for example, I'm just going to focus in one article, I'm just going to focus on people with mental health conditions and how they experienced, you know, the lockdown. And even within those people who revealed that they'd been diagnosed with a significant mental health condition prior to the lockdown, some of them coped really well with the lockdown, others were struggling, and some of them found some conditions re-emerging. There's one example of someone with obsessive compulsive disorder who found all the emphasis on hand washing really did spark off something that she had controlled quite successfully until then, for example. So yes, there's a lot of, and I will probably more and more, the themes across the different case studies will definitely be identified as I go through, but this is all a work in progress. Yeah, and I'm in the middle of all this. So you got to hear some early findings really, but thank you for your comments.
Okay, thank you. And the next one is Rona, and just a quick reminder, Rona, tell us a bit about yourself and how you're dealing with this crisis in your corner of the world.
Yes. Could you hear me? I just want to make sure that.
Yes,
okay, perfect.
We can hear you well.
Hello, everyone. I'm so happy to be part of this conversation. My name is Rona Relova. I am out here in Palo Alto, California. So good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. I just wanted to thank Deborah for a very good, very good presentation. I did see it twice on YouTube to prepare for this conversation. And I wanted to ask you, it looked like you had a very huge, well, it was huge enough cohort, and you had a very diverse one, and you covered different parts of different parts of the country. There is like an urban and rural and different ages. My question is, did you, because I didn't see it in the presentation, or maybe I missed it, was there any part there that a certain group would look at it as the rules of masking and hand sanitizing is an assault in their personal or civil liberties? Because and if you did find that, like, you know, I'm not going to do it because it's an assault, I'm not going to distance, I'm going to go wherever I want, I'm not going to wear a mask because it is an assault in my civil liberty. If you did encounter that, would you be able to identify, are these Is this from whatever age group, or is it more on the urban versus rural? So I would be very interested to know that. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes. Well, this is it's an interesting question because, again, I guess it highlights the differences between the culture of individualism in the US versus that of Australia. We have not experienced that kind of pushback as you have in the US against protective behaviours against COVID. And most people have accepted lockdown conditions. They've accepted the fact that in Melbourne, our second largest city, for example, at the moment, they've been in a very strict lockdown involving a curfew actually from 8 p.m. to I think 6 a.m. where people can actually go out of their homes at that time. There's been very little pushback against that because I think Australian cultural kind of understandings of public health imperatives are very, very different. I think a lot of us sit back and see what's going on in the US kind of with horror and lack of understanding because it's very foreign to our culture. So no, I didn't have anyone who articulated those kinds of very sort of sovereign citizen views as we do see amongst a considerable group in the US. There was one man, older man in his 60s, who did talk about how it's just the flu, and I think the government's exaggerated the risk, and he said, I haven't really changed my behaviours very much. He was living in a rural region anyway, where there were very few cases, so in fact he didn't really need to be all that worried about changing his behaviour. He was really just the only example, and that gets back to the broader difference between the US and Australia in terms of how accepting we are of public health measures. We accepted seatbelt wearing much more readily than Americans did, for example. And so we have a long history of being a bit more docile when it comes to an accepting of public health measures.
Yep, thank you so much. Just a little bit of follow up and then I'll keep quiet. And I think this is this inflection point. I think this is not about, that is why you're successful. That's what it is.
Yeah.
That's why a lot of countries are successful in mitigating this. It's not because the other countries, they have lack of education or lack of resources. It's really about the cultural mindset. Am I going to do this for my neighbor, or I'm going to do it for myself? You said the word, the individualism, which is actually the problem. If there is one root cause why we couldn't control it, it is that. It's not a lack of education, not a lack of education or resources. It is that responsibility that I am responsible and accountable for my neighbor. So I shouldn't be going around without the mask, which is actually something such a big other conversation. So thank you so much. And I'm so glad to be part of this conversation.
Thank you. Well, obviously we have a very different political leader as well. So, yes, we did not have Trump.
Totally agree.
So anybody else would like to, I don't have anybody else in the queue. Anybody else like to, even if Susan or Catherine, you want to come back and follow up with another point, or anybody else like to intervene? We'd like to hear from some of the other folks, particularly from other parts of the world. I noticed there was somebody from Nigeria here in the group. I can't see where everyone else is from.
You looked in the chat, Bill?
Yeah, I've looked in the chat and I can see Dr. Golda Ekendo. I don't know whether...
Dr. Golda has asked, how would you rate the contributions of Australian citizens in stemming the spread of COVID-19? There.
How would I rate it? Well, it gets back to what I was just saying, really, that Australians have been quite responsible and have, for the most part, been very, very supportive of public health measures and even lockdown measures. They understand it's important, and they They have conformed to it for the most part. And I think, again, it gets back to our political leadership. We have state leadership and federal leadership, and most of the state leaders, the premiers of the states, have actually led the sort of most of the kind of decisions about what should happen in each state. And most people, when I talk to them, most people were very positive about their state leaders, their premiers, and their response. And they have been very much led also by the major health officials in each state who've been giving every day, they give updates. And people really respect that they're giving that information, and they respect their expertise. So, and the premiers are listening to them. So we have a very, very different situation compared with what's going on in the US.
Yeah, I don't. The worst places to be are England and Brazil and the US at the moment. They're the places that have been hardest hit, which have had responses which are sort of chaotic and inconsistent. So yeah, that's been. So yeah, those comparative things are really important, and there are lessons in that for the future, I think. You know, I was going to ask you a question, Deborah. You're obviously somebody who's well versed in this area. This is what you do all the time. In your research, what surprised you?
Thanks, Bill. That's a journalist question. I always get that.
I ask that of all my students, by the way. It's not okay. For me, it's
yeah,
you know, like don't tell me
what you
already know. I want to know what you discovered. That kind of question.
Yeah. No, it's just something that I'm just joking. I'm just joking. But it's I often get asked that, you know, when journalists ask me what surprised you. But no, it's a very good question. Very good question. What did surprise me is the fact, so I guess as part of our media coverage of coronavirus, we have had quite a bit of focus on sort of the suffering and isolation that people are feeling. And yes, of course, some people are feeling that due to lockdown conditions, particularly those who went into the second lockdown in Melbourne and Victoria, the state of Victoria. What did surprise me when I actually talked to this very varied group of people was the fact that there were a lot of people who weren't suffering from the lockdown, as I alluded to earlier, and their lives hadn't really changed very much. I was kind of expecting a lot more distress and not anger, because as I say, I think Australians did accept that it was important to go into lockdown. But I was surprised that there were quite a few people who just said, oh, well, you know, I'm used to I'm not a very social person, or, you know, I live in a farm, or I just, you know, I don't go out very much anyway. And it did tend to be older people, and it did tend to be people living in rural regions. Young people were those really most affected. They, you know, their social life, and the very important part of their life, you know, for a lot of young people is getting independence, being able to move out of home, being able to see their friends and peers, being able to go to university on campus. And here in Australia, all our university teaching has switched and remains online for basically since March. And we haven't had the big semester break that you people have, because our semester break doesn't happen till our summer over the Christmas period. So everyone's been learning online at university, and that has affected young people who haven't had the chances to have that, you know, those social interactions with their peers as they otherwise would. And of course, we've also had the situation where young people have been the people who've mostly lost their jobs compared to older people. So in Australia, and I'm not sure how that compares to other countries, but in Australia it has been young people economically affected the most, and also socially affected the most.
Catherine, of course, let's, if we don't have any other volunteers at the moment, so over to you again. And maybe, Catherine, one of the things that's interesting is, you know, how is this, you know, a comparative thing about your own work, your own situation where you are? I mean, how does Deborah's insights and Deborah's work relate to you in terms of your context?
Yes, thank you. So, well, as I said, I'm living in the US, and I'm a recent graduate. I'm sort of starting out in my life in sort of these very unconventional, difficult and strained conditions. And I guess in relation to the question I'm going to ask, this is sort of more abstract, but here in the US, there's a lot of denial and perpetuations of falsehoods. That's really been difficult to get people even like up to speed with how severe the situation is here. So I'm afraid that when, you know, hopefully when things start going back to normal, people will sort of easily forget the way things were here and the sort of inequalities and failures of a lot of the systems we have here, and how they've contributed to the spread of the pandemic and stuff like that. So I guess my question is, you know, based on your research, Deborah, do you have a sense of how people might think of this in the future? You know, I'm wondering the longevity of this experience for them. If you repeated this in 6 months, a year, 5 years, would people understand the severity of the situation and the pandemic, or would time sort of soften their perspectives of what they're going through right now? Because that's kind of my fear here in the US, that people are already not taking it as seriously as maybe they should, and that time might not help things in that sense.
Yeah, thank you, Catherine. It's a really interesting question, and it does get back to how different countries, but also different parts of the country, as I've explained in some, even in Australia, where we have a comparatively small population, there's been a very great variability of experience of the COVID lockdown that everyone's gone through, but people have responded to it differently. My view is that the crisis isn't going to change, it isn't going to get better anytime soon. And I think that it's taken it's taken a while for people here in Australia to realise that. And from the sounds of it in the US, some people haven't been as quite kind of knowledgeable about what's going on and how badly it's affected other people in the US. Which could be, yes, a problem with communication, the way the media is organised in the US, and also with the political leadership, of course. We've had very clear messages all the way through from our leaders about what the situation is, and people have been following the situation very closely. So they are quite knowledgeable for the most part. What I think changed when we seemed to be doing really well with containing the spread a few months ago, people felt, right, it's over, you know, we come out of lockdown, everything's cool. But then we had the second surge in Melbourne, our second largest city, and they still are in lockdown right now. And they have been for like 6 weeks, some of them for longer. I think that really, Australians' certainty was really rocked by that, and now we realise that this pandemic is not going to be over soon, even in our country where we have managed it fairly well. And it now has been announced we're in the worst recession for 30 years. I think as time goes on, actually, we are all becoming more aware that actually this isn't, you know, a short-term crisis. I would have thought that in the US, as people do become, and it's also the issue that I explained in my presentation, that it took a while for people to realise that the risk was actually going to directly affect them. And I mentioned some examples of what it took. It was numbers of cases suddenly appearing to be really high in Australia. It was finding out that someone who lives in your town has COVID. It was your doctor warning you that you might be at risk because you have a condition or you're older. That it seems to me that maybe in the US, people haven't experienced those moments of realisation because it hasn't begun to directly affect them yet, because there have been pockets of the country where there hasn't been perhaps a large spread, but it will inevitably happen, I would have thought. So as time goes on, people will become more and more aware, if they weren't already, that yes, this is really going to affect them personally, them and their families. I'm not that optimistic that this pandemic is going to be very well contained even within the next year. Our major airline, Qantas, has said they're not going to start international flights until at least a year from now. So we're not going to be traveling overseas for at least another year. And it's that kind of announcement that makes you, you know, our international borders have been closed for a long time now, since March. We haven't been able to fly out of the country. You know, I don't want to sound pessimistic, but I think everyone in every country really has to, and will eventually be aware that things aren't going to improve sooner rather than later. It will be a long, long process of getting containment of the pandemic, and that there were going to be surges and resurges. We've seen this in Europe already. People relaxed, they went on their summer holidays, and then places like Spain and France had a sudden, you know, dramatic resurgence of the virus that they had previously contained. And we learned, as I say, we've learned that now in Australia as well. And we've got our summer coming up here. So we're going to have to think about ways to contain the pandemic when we all want to go out and relax and enjoy ourselves. We can't really do that. We don't even know if our state borders will be open before Christmas, so that people might not even be able to share Christmas with their families, which is a major thing in Australia. So I don't know if people in the future will be. I would like to go back in 6 months and a year's time and so on and do a follow-up, because I think it would be really, really interesting to see what will be happening and what will be going on in people's heads. So I actually am applying for money to do that, because I really do want that. But I would say that as the you know, the sheer burden of what is happening in this crisis globally starts to filter into people's understandings, I don't think they will forget this time. I really don't. I think that in some cases, for some people, the worst is yet to come, actually.
It's very sobering. So, all right, we're going to move on now to Chivu, and I think this probably is near, we're a bit, this was meant to be about half an hour, but we're a little bit over, but I think that's probably okay. So I'm going to hand over to you now, Chivu, for your comment and question.
Oh, hi. You can call me Chi. And first of all, thank you for this opportunity. And probably, of course, you don't know me, but Deborah, thank you, because I've been actually, you're very familiar to me, because I use your book for my class, and the risk book, and also the risk in everyday life. And actually, the name of my seminar is Risk and Seminar. So actually, I was very excited when I got to know that you're going to be the speaker for this at this conference. But too bad I didn't get to know in person. And also, it was also a great surprise when I saw your presentation about the COVID narrative, because I also did a similar research about there's a COVID perception and trying to collect the narratives. And I presented the paper about this research at this conference. So it was a very, 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 very good to listen to your presentation. But anyway, I'm sorry, I forgot to introduce myself. So my name is Ji, and actually I'm right now I'm a lecturer at the Keio University in Japan, but I'm not Japanese. I'm from Vietnam. So because of this background, I got the opportunities to interview both Japanese and Vietnamese to get to know their perception about how they see the virus, and depending on the different political systems. Actually, it was very interesting to see sort of the difference in the way they react to this coronavirus. So one sort of interesting finding I gathered through this narrative is that, for the Vietnamese look at the narrative not as a threat, but more like as an opportunity to reflect on their life. And for Japanese, the coronavirus probably similar to what happened in Australia or other countries, that the virus is really right in the middle of their everyday life. So they're living with it and they're trying to cope with it. So and it has a lot to do with the very limited role of the government. And Vietnam is the communist government, so the control of the government, it worked, but at the same time it really affected how they see the virus itself, and they can externalize the virus out of their everyday life. So that's sort of the finding to my my research, and and that's more like a comment. And my question is that I'm also very interested in the COVID assemblages that you presented. The thing I just wanted to learn more about this. You know, how can I make it more operational to, for example, how to prepare for this type of research, or how to use it to analyze the data. So that's what I wanted to hear more, so that I can make use of that for my you know, the coming rounds of the research. And thank you.
Thanks, Chi. That's really fascinating. Yeah, I must look up your presentation. I was actually in Japan myself in January this year. That was my last international trip. I was on a holiday. And what I really noticed was I mean, I was reading the English language press when I was in Japan. And of course, that was a time at which China was experiencing the first cases, but Japan was already being affected because of Chinese New Year holidays. Weren't, you know, they were worried about, you know, infection from China due to all because they do get a lot of tourists from China in Japan. And so I could see, you know, I could already see a risk narrative happening there from the Japanese perspective. And another thing I really noticed was the face mask wearing, which is already, as you would know, a very common practice in Japan anyway in winter. And so they weren't wearing face masks to deal with COVID because they hadn't yet seen themselves at risk of COVID in January, but it was just a normal practice. And so I was quite fascinated by that, because it's certainly not in Australia for people to wear face masks. Anyway, that's just an aside, but yes, I mean, it really is interesting for me to see and to compare with what's going on in different countries. I actually, and some of you might be interested in a special issue of the Journal Health Sociology Review that I edited, and it came out in July, and we have perspectives there from Mexico, from Hong Kong, Singapore, the US and the UK. For example, there's a piece in that special issue that compares the leadership, Trump's leadership in the US with Trudeau's leadership in Canada around COVID. The Mexican piece is based on anthropological fieldwork in the city of Monterrey in Mexico by a man who's a general practitioner, but also a medical anthropologist, and talking to women about their sort of risk perceptions in relation to COVID, and very much inflected in their case through their religious belief. So I just recommend that special issue for those of you who are interested in this cross-cultural understandings of risk. And back to your question, Chi, about analysing the materials. So I tend to use the term research materials these days when I talk about my research, because I actually do have in many research projects a multi-material approach. I also don't like the term mixed methods either, because I kind of think that's a bit overused. So I talk about my research materials. So in example of this particular project, they are mostly telephone interviews. We did comprise detailed case studies, and I'm using that approach as my analytical approach, but also with my own photographs that I referred to, that I'm using as background context. So I have the research materials from kind of photographing the material environment that Australians are living through, in mostly in my case in Sydney and Canberra. I'm doing another project that involves a digital diary where people are uploading reflections into basically a simple Google format, and taking photos themselves and uploading. I'm doing another project where we're doing using Zoom on someone's phone and going into their homes, and they're taking us on a video ethnography tour of their homes and talking about digital technologies in the home. So I'm actually experimenting with lots of different methods, and in that project, it's the videos that we're making as well as the conversations that we're having with people that are our research materials. So I think it really depends on what your theoretical underpinnings are. If you are adopting a socio-material approach, that will structure, of course, what kind of materials you are wanting to generate and analyze, and also the concepts that you are using when you're analysing your materials. You know, thinking with theory is the concept that's used now in post-qualitative research, and I could do a whole lecture about post-qualitative research, but I don't have the time now. But it's the idea that that you yourself are a research assemblage. If we're talking about assemblages, you know, you as the researcher and your research team, if you have one, the people that you're working with, the participants in your research, the other people, you know, the technologies that you're using, if you're using digital technologies or analog technologies, they are all part of the research assemblage. And so that's the sort of theoretical approach that I now work with when I'm analysing my materials, acknowledging that it's always ever a partial interpretation, but that is the inevitability of any kind of research. And being upfront about that, and basically saying, you know, these are the issues that I'm interested in developing. As I'm working through the case studies in this particular project, I'm constantly thinking to myself, well, what does this person's narrative tell me about the kind of materialities of their experience, you know, their geographical location and the importance of that. So it is, in some cases, I guess, quite an anthropological approach, because it is very contextual and cited. But as well as, and so when I'm presenting, when I'm writing up my articles, I'm actually using the case study approach. So I might select 4 or 5 case studies and just talk about those case studies in the article I'm writing. But in another article I'm writing, I am looking across the case studies and just using excerpts from a greater number of case studies. So there's lots of different ways to do it. But, you know, for me, it's all about being able to convey the richness and the diversity of experience. And doing a thematic approach sometimes obviates that richness and diversity, and that's where doing a case study approach can really highlight, you know, the lived experience as in a narrative format. So that's why I'm choosing it mostly for this particular project. I hope that kind of answered your question.
No, thanks very much. And I think, yeah, from my point of view too, I think the methodological stuff that you're proposing is one of the most interesting parts of this presentation as well. So, look, everyone, thank you very much. I know we've gone a bit over time, but it was a kind of a rich and interesting conversation. Thank you, everyone, for being there. We'll keep a recording of this if you want to track back over some of it. We'll get it posted onto the website. And yeah, as I say, thank you very much, and particularly thank you to you, Deborah, for doing such interesting work and presenting it in such a thought-provoking kind of way. So very much appreciated. So we'll do the Zoom thing. We'll all wave to each other, and we'll see you all somewhere else sometime soon. Hopefully, when we run the conference again, we'll see you all in person. Okay, bye then, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
See you.
Thanks, Bill.
Bye. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.